Hi, my name is Robert. This video is designed to give you step-by-step detailed instruction on completing the task at hand. Visit my YouTube channel and watch my disclaimer video. And please like, share, and subscribe. I hope you find the information you're looking for. Thank you very much for watching. Lately I've been seeing a lot of information and questions about people having misfire codes. So I'm going to do a little video to hopefully help you be able to deal with that and understand what's going on with it. First off, anytime your car is running rough, shaking at idle, seems to be vibrating the car at idle, more than likely it's misfiring. If a car has bad mounts or something like that, that usually wouldn't make it shake or vibrate at idle. Anytime somebody tells me their car is shaking, I right away know that it's more than likely misfiring. This is normally also evident by a check engine light on your instrument cluster. Some people ride around with those lights on all the time, something you really shouldn't do, because if another error happens in the system, you won't know about it because you've been riding around with a bad O2 error code. So if at all possible, if you can afford it, when you can afford it, get your car fixed so that you're not riding around with a check engine light. That way when things like a misfire occurs, you have notification by the pointing of the misfire code. Pretty much this is the minimum things required to diagnose a misfire code. I use a magnet to pull spark plugs out of the wells because a lot of times they're deep. You got a socket spark plug wrench to get spark plugs out. You got a compression gauge to check compression if it gets that far. You got a code reader to read the codes, and you got gloves to protect your hand. 99 times out of 100, you have a misfire code. You'll have a check engine light on your dash, and you can stick your code reader into your OBD2 port and check it for codes. And when you hit the scan and hit codes, my car has no codes, but usually it'll say a code of P0301 or 302 or 300, 30, however many cylinders you have. Most of the time it'll point to the exact cylinder that has the misfire. It's not very common for you to have multiple misfires, but if you do have multiple misfires, that's another issue. So we'll go ahead and cover some of that. Let's just assume that I have a P0302 code, which means that my number 2 cylinder is misfiring. This is what my code reader looks like when it's showing a misfire on number 2. Yours may have more details and say misfire cylinder 2. And I'm going to link a misfire troubleshooting video right here as well. Okay, my car is a 5-cylinder, and here you can see the intake manifold: 1 cylinder, 2 cylinder, 3 cylinder, 4 cylinders, 5 cylinder. You may have to look in your owner's manual to see how your engine is laid out and where the cylinders are. My number 1 is in the front, up by the timing cover. My number 5 is in the back, by the distributor cap in the wires. So if I have a number 2 misfire, I have to pull this cover off of my motor and then pull my number 2 spark plug to see what's going on in that cylinder. Now, I'm not 100% sure how it does it, but somehow your car's computer knows when it's not firing all 5 cylinders. It probably gets some kind of reading back from the spark plug wires or something, letting this computer know that this engine is firing on all of its cylinders. What a car needs to fire, it needs fuel, it needs air, it needs compression, and it needs a spark signal and a good spark plug to fire that off. So if you're having a misfire, one of those things is not happening in that particular cylinder. The cylinder's not getting spark, it's not getting enough fuel, it's not getting enough compression, it's not getting enough air, or it's not getting the right mixture of those things. So when we try to diagnose a misfire, we have to determine what exactly is going on in there. Occasionally I'll have people ask, well, is my mass airflow sensor bad? Is that causing a misfire? Or is my fuel pump going bad? Is that causing a misfire? You know, what exactly is it that's causing a misfire? Well, if you have one specific cylinder misfiring, say number 2, then it's not your mass airflow sensor, it's not your fuel pump, it's not some other common component. Because if a common component was going bad, like your fuel pump or your mass flow air sensor, which controls air going to the motor, then you would have multiple misfires. All the cylinders would misfire, something like that. An example, one time I had my car tilted on a crooked road. Well, that was causing my fuel pump not to pick up my gas, and my car was simulating running out of gas because it was running out of gas because of the way the car was tilted, and I got a multiple misfire. All of my cylinders misfired. So I got the car flattened out, the fuel started sucking back up in there, and my misfires went away. I cleared the code and all was fine, and I got more gas in the car so that wouldn't happen. But if you're having a specific misfire code, you need to find out why. Now, for the sake of speed and illustration, I'm not going to do this, but I would remove my spark plug cover so I have access to my spark plugs. Not all people are able to do this because sometimes spark plugs are under manifolds and stuff like that, especially on your V6 and your V8 style cars. But on my car, I have easy access to all my spark plugs. So let's say I had a misfire on number 2. I pull my cover, I pull that spark plug, and what I want to do is look at that spark plug and see if that spark plug looks serviceable or if it looks damaged or if it looks like it's not being functioned properly. Now, when you pull a spark plug out of a motor, this is kind of what you want it to look like. Not too much black around the top of it. The tip of it seems like it's in good shape, and the very tip of it, the arm that goes over, isn't all deteriorated and busted up. So you want to make sure that the spark plug pretty much looks like this. So it's allowed to have some discoloring, but to confirm that your spark plug is in good shape, you can go to a website like Champion or NGK or something like that and look at the example of the spark plugs on their website so you can see the kind of condition you're having with yours. Now, if you've been running your car and you shut it off and the spark plug is wet with gas, you can kind of guess that this spark plug was not being fired because it's soaked with fuel. Now, every car has spark plugs that have the specific gap it's supposed to be. The gap is supposed to be from the very tip of the core to the arm that goes over them. Now, if for some reason you have special plugs that has multiple pins that come across, there's nothing you could do about the gap on those. But if you have a spark plug like this platinum or double platinum or regular copper tips, you can measure that gap to make sure it's within the specifications of your owner's manual or the specifications of some other kind of service manual that tells you what that gap is supposed to be. If that gap is far off, say for instance mine is supposed to be 0.035 and I measure it and it's 0.045, it's highly likely that the spark plug is worn or misgapped, so that's causing my misfire. I just adjust this with my spark plug gap gauge so that I get back within the proper range so that the car will let that cylinder fire again. So the first thing you want to do is pull the plug and check the spark plug gap and check the condition of the spark plug to make sure that it's proper. If the gap is wrong or the spark plug looks bad, replace the spark plug, clear the code, start the car up, drive it 5 or 10 minutes, and then recheck to see if your misfire comes back. If your misfire comes back, you need to go to step number 2. Alright, step number 2, you want to verify that your spark plug is actually sparking. If you have plugs and wires like my car has, an older car, what I normally do is I disconnect my fuel supply. I either pull my fuse for my fuel pump or else I will pull my fuel pump relay. Then I'll pull the plug back out of the motor. I'll hook the spark plug wire up to the plug. I'll lay the plug close to a bolt on the motor or lay it out across so that it's sitting somewhere where I can see it. I'll crank the car or have somebody crank it, and I'll look in that gap to see if spark is jumping from this tip of the plug to the core of the plug. If I'm not getting any spark going into that plug, or with a spark plug tester, if you're fortunate enough to have one of those, then I know I got a problem. Either I got a bad spark plug wire or my distributor is bad. Now, most of your cars newer than say year 2000, they don't actually have the distributor cap and rotor and wires that go over to the spark plug. That's all more of an electronic system that's controlled by the computer, and they actually have individual coil packs bolted on top of each spark plug. If you have that kind of system, you have to unplug the coil, take the coil off the spark plug just to gain access to the spark plug, and then the best way to test the coil to see if it's working and providing spark to the plug is, let's say your number 2 is misfiring. I would take the coil off of number 2 and switch it with the coil on number 3 or number 4 or number 5. Then I would bolt everything back together, take the car for a test drive, and when your check engine light comes back on, I would read the code reader to see if the misfire moved with the coil swap. So if the coil was on number 2 and you put it on number 5 and now number 5 is misfiring, I believe it is safe to say that you had a bad coil and you need to replace that coil. Go ahead, replace that coil and make sure that the problem stays away. And if it doesn't, we have to move to the next step. Now, the next step in tracking down a single cylinder misfire is to check to see if that cylinder is getting fuel. Now, if you pulled that spark plug out and that spark plug was dry, didn't have no fuel on it, there's a chance that, hey, you're not getting good fuel from your fuel injector. So, you might want to check your wires going to your fuel injector, but what I would do before verifying the fuel injector situation is I would check compression in that cylinder. As I stated in the beginning of the video, in order for a car to fire and have proper ignition every time it cycles, it's got to have good compression. So what you want to do is you want to deactivate the fuel system again, either pull the relay for the fuel pump or pull the fuel diffuse for the fuel pump. And you also want to deactivate the ignition system because you don't want the ignition system sparking when you're not going to run the car. That way you can check your compression. I have a couple of compression test videos that you can check and view to see how to do a proper compression test, but we're just going to talk about it real quick and get that compression checked on that cylinder to see if that's your problem, why you're not getting good fire and reporting misfires on that cylinder. So you got your spark plug for that cylinder removed, you got your fuel pump deactivated, you got your ignition system deactivated, either by disconnecting the lead off the coil, or you pulled some kind of fuse or relay or unplugged the coil system so that your coil packs are not firing. You pull that spark plug out, you take the compression gauge and you screw it down in the hole that the spark plug comes out of. You don't have to screw it tight, just hand tight is good enough. It's got a nice rubber seal on there to seal it off so it doesn't leak air. So now you go in the car, you crank the car and you listen to it turn over about 8 times. Ring, 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 ring. After 8 times, you stop. You come back out, you look at this gauge. You need to find out what is good compression for your particular car. On my car, the compression is supposed to be between 156 psi and 186 psi. Now, if I hook this gauge up, crank the motor over, and my pressure is down around 60, for some reason I have bad compression in that cylinder. Now, if that compression is under 60, say it's like 30 or less, there's a good chance that I have a burnt valve. So, if a car's burned a valve, it's going to have a misfire, and that misfire is because you don't have good compression. So, let me talk a little bit about burnt valves. Now, if your car's got low compression in a cylinder, the quickest way to determine if it's a piston or a valve problem is to pour a little oil down through the hole that the spark plug came out of. There's a piston under that spark plug that comes up and almost hits that spark plug to make compressed air, so that when the fuel and the spark happens, it creates a good explosion. Well, in the case that you may have a bad piston or a bad piston ring, you pour about an ounce of oil down that cylinder. You can go 2 ounces if you want to go overboard. You let that sit for about a minute, and that's about as much as a shot glass. Then you put the compression gauge back on it, you crank it back up, and when you crank it back up, if your pressure went from, let's say, 30 psi up to 150 psi or over 100 psi, you know that that oil sealed up some kind of leak in air escapage, and the problem is with the piston. But if that pressure is still real low, around 30, somewhere around there where it was initially, then you more than likely have a burnt valve. Now, most of your modern car motors, especially these overhead cam motors, as you can see, I have 5 cylinders and 20 valves. So each one of my cylinders has 2 valves. There's 2 valves on the intake and there's 2 valves on the exhaust. Now, cars burn valves, and what a burnt valve means is that this valve got so hot and the temperature was so extreme that it caused the valve to chip or crack, or a little piece of that valve came off and is no longer there. So when that valve is supposed to come back up and make a tight seal so that pressure could build in that cylinder, air is escaping past that valve. Now, some people say, what causes a burnt valve? The most common reason for a burnt valve is internal oil leakage past the seal that is lubricated to help that valve go up and down. The valve in the motor goes up and down rapidly as the motor runs, and there's little rubber seals at those valve stems. These valve stem seals, over the life of your engine, they get hard, and some oils is better than others in keeping them soft. But if oil starts seeping by them because of they're old and not conditioned, then oil will settle on those valves. And if those valves seep open a little bit when the engine shuts off, that oil gets down on the tip of that valve and it cooks and crystallizes there. Well, over time, when the engine starts running, that stops that valve from seating sealed closed when the motor's running, and when the valve doesn't close off properly, it causes it to get hotter and hotter and hotter. Let's say these valves are supposed to be conditioned to take up to 900 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, a valve that's not seating closed properly because of this excessive oil leakage over time, that valve may get up to 1,600 degrees or 1,800 degrees, and that extreme heat, because it's not sitting closed all the time, will cause that valve to crack, chip, and break off. Now you have a burnt valve. Well, sad to say that a burnt valve is just as bad as having a blown head gasket. The motor has to come apart, the valve has to be replaced, the motor has to go back together, normally with a new head gasket, to fix the problem. Most of the time people experience that problem, they tear the head down and replace all of those seals to avoid that from happening again, which it shouldn't happen for a long time, but nonetheless, it's normally an expense that sometimes exceeds the value of the car. So, that's how you chase down a misfire. If you got any questions, go ahead and post them. Last but not least, there's a chance that you have a problem with fuel delivery. Now, if you check your compression and your compression is good, the last thing I would check is fuel delivery. And if you pulled that spark plug out and it was dry and you've been having misfires there, there's a chance that you don't have good fuel delivery. So, almost every car you deal with will have a fuel line that comes over to a fuel rail or two. And when you look at the fuel rail, let me pull this one off. On these Volvos, these rails just lift off. And now you have access to each fuel injector, 2, 3, 4, 5. The wires there, you want to make sure that the wires are in good condition. And you can make sure that the fuel injector down in there has a good seal into the motor. Now on my car, I can disconnect this fuel line, remove these 2 bolts, and my fuel rail will lift off of this motor intake manifold. I have to be careful I don't damage my fuel line here that goes to my pressure regulator. But once I get that fuel rail up, I need to make sure that all the seals that seal the injector as they go into the motor are in good condition. So there you see that fuel injector going into the manifold, and there are several of those that go into the manifold. I have to make sure that those seals are good. If one of those seals are bad, it may cause a misfire because air pressure may be escaping the intake valves through that injector there. Also, I want to make sure my wires are good, and I want to make sure that injector fires. So, if I suspect I got a bad fuel injector, I can unattach that injector, move it over to the other position, move that one over to that position, start the car, take it for a test drive, read the codes. If my misfire moved with my injector swap, I likely have a bad fuel injector. I can replace the fuel injector or take it to a shop somewhere that can see if it can be cleaned out and repaired. Now, if you suspect that you're having misfires because of fuel injectors being clogged, you can sometimes run fuel injector cleaner through them to clean them up and get them from not being gummed up or whatever the problem is that's causing them to not spray a good solid pattern of fuel into the cylinder so it can fire. So there you have it. You had a problem with spark, you have a problem with compression, you have a problem with fuel delivery, or you have a problem with an ignition coil, or maybe even a spark plug. I've even heard of people pulling the spark plug out and the spark plug would be broken. So I wouldn't put it past even the spark plug being broken. But those are the steps you want to take to figure out why you got a particular cylinder misfiring. If you got any questions, go ahead and post them. If you feel that this information was beneficial, please like it and share it with your social media friends. You can also subscribe to my channel so that you can get notification of future videos that I post. Visit my channel. I have all types of do-it-yourself videos there. You can leave questions here and I'll try to respond to them as quick as possible. You can also visit my website at robertspinner.com. Thanks again for watching.